President Bush today talking in New York City about the global financial crisis and urging patience as governments around the world respond.
It's going to require more time for these improvements to fully take hold, and there's going to be difficult days ahead. But the United States and our partner are taking the right steps to get through this crisis.
And this weekend, President Bush will meet with leaders from the Group of 20 nations here in Washington. They will discuss a range of steps to prevent future financial crises, but they may not end up agreeing on all of those ideas. Joining me now, Stanford University economics professor, former Treasury Undersecretary John Taylor. John Taylor, good to see you as always, coming to us tonight from Ottawa, Canada. And let me ask you your thoughts about this G-20 conference taking place here in Washington. Do you think much can be achieved here, given the fact that President Bush is going to be leaving office so soon, and we're still in the middle of this crisis?
Well, it's an important meeting. It's the first time all these leaders have come together. Of course, their ministers and central bank governors just met last weekend, but having them come together to emphasize the importance of this issue and to actually give a charge to the future of what's going to happen. So I think it's an important meeting. It's an important time to clarify what the responses are. And as President Bush indicated, coming to agreement on the causes and the responses so far and what can happen next. So I think it's an important opportunity to show leadership for all these people.
Do you get a sense as we head into this meeting that the Europeans, some of the foreign leaders who will be coming here are coming here with a much more specific list of changes they want to see than say, the United States is prepared to accept at this point?
Sure. There's no question people are coming at this with different perspectives, and that's why it's important to begin with analyzing the causes and come to some agreement on that. You know, some people think this is a market failure. Other people emphasize the failure of government to respond, or in the case of the United States, not to rein in some of the government agencies like Fannie and Freddie, or the provision of liquidity in large amounts in the early parts of this decade. So I think it's important to emphasize that government had a role in causing this, and government should have a response to it. There's going to be others who are blaming the markets, but I think having a discussion of it and making sure you get the right solution and don't overreact, if you like, to things that are not problems. Don't do too much. So, of course, there's going to be disagreement. That's the nature of international discussions, but coming to an agreement on how to proceed is quite important for that reason.
John, what about the blame game that's going to play out? I talked to Treasury Secretary Paulson a little bit about this today. Do you have a sense that there will be a major effort on the part of some of these foreign nations to pin the blame on the United States, and should the United States accept the blame? Did this, in fact, start here and then spread around the world?
You know, I think it's not a good idea to be pointing fingers at this point, because people, just like in our politics, people are sick of pointing fingers at this point, want to move ahead and get things done. And I think there's a sense in which things began in the United States, but there's also a sense in which the regulators were not on top of things in Europe. Their mistakes were made in other parts of the world. So this is something where mistakes were made by government officials, to be sure, in different parts of the world, and I think that's the reason to analyze carefully what the cause of this whole thing was. It's not just the United States.
Are there any specific regulatory changes that you've seen put out there so far from any of these world leaders that you think these nations can agree on, maybe not right away at this meeting this weekend, but perhaps down the road? I know Gordon Brown in England, for example, has talked about perhaps an international supervisory regulatory agency to oversee the world's largest financial institutions, given the fact that those banks do so much business across country borders.
You know, I don't think necessarily have to go that far, but you do have to come to grips with the responses of the regulatory agencies thus far, which have missed a lot. You had the off-balance sheet operations, the SIVs, that was not just in the United States. You had the lack of transparency. You still have a major problem of knowing what's on the bank's balance sheets. That's why there's still a lot of mistrust in the credit markets. So I think it's important first to say what should happen in each of the countries, and then if you think there's a reason that these are globally connected in a way, then yes, take these steps. But the first step really is to make sure that we're not causing more problems by not dealing with the domestic agencies and having them address the problems that are country specific.
Do you think there is a real risk here of unintended consequences of the cart getting before the horse here, and regulatory changes, new regulatory regimes being put in place before people have a good sense of exactly what went wrong?
Absolutely, there's a chance of that, and that's why I say again, the first thing on the list of 5 is to come to some agreement on the causes of this, the response so far, usually in these kinds of issues, once there's some sense of why it happened, some agreement about that, some agreement about why the responses perhaps were not what they should have been so far, then the solutions seem to fall in place, and you can get much more agreement about that. So I think the cart before the horse is a problem, but the horse at this point should be the reasons it happened, agreement about that. And to some extent, it's hard for government officials to address those things, quite frankly, because some of the mistakes were made by government officials. So it's good to have the private sector and others looking at it as well.
All right, John Taylor, Stanford University, former Treasury Undersecretary. As always, we appreciate the time. Thanks for joining us.